talking about today is our take on how small companies should approach ERGs. We discussed last week the ERG relaunch plan, basically saying that if your ERG is not where you want it to be, if it doesn't have that structure, that stability, regular programming, if your ERG leaders are burnt out, here's the plan on how you get your ERG program to a place where things can be more sustainable and more productive. And this is based off of things that I've actually done, tried and tested myself more than once. I've been able to restart ERG programs in less than 90 days using this method. So I highly recommend checking that out. I preface this conversation with that because a lot of the principles that we talk about today will still be based on the same ones that we talked about. I'm not giving out super new information here because it's what I've been saying for the past few episodes, but I'll give some context on why it is that we give the suggestions that we do, and we'll get into it. Okay, really quickly, first thing is when I say small companies, what am I referencing? Really, when I say small companies, I'm not saying under like 1,000, because I know that relatively, when you think of a really huge company with hundreds of thousands of employees, I know that small can be super relative. When I say small, I'm talking to the people who maybe have under 400 employees at their company. This conversation is really to help you all set an ERG at your company the right way. This way, in a couple of years, you won't be like a lot of the other companies now who are looking to relaunch their programs and get it into a better position. Before we get into what our recommendation is and why, I'll just recap the 3 principles of the ERG movement. So principle number 1, an ERG must operate like a business enterprise. When I say that, I'm not referencing a business unit or the marketing team that exists within your company. I'm saying an ERG must operate just like a true, fully built out company. That's really important, but I know when I say that, it can sound really intimidating. And that's why we have a community. That's why we have resources to help bring that to life. But that is the success of ERGs, is an ERG that's operating as a business enterprise. Principle number 2 is that ERGs must have impact on both the members and the business. There was a time where ERGs, sometimes they were called different names, affinity groups, could just have impact on the members. And there were times where ERGs could be really focused on the business only, where they're typically called BRGs. That's no longer the case. ERGs have to have a return on impact for the business that they operate within. But in addition to that, the members are the ones who are going to drive this impact. So it has to have an impact on the members as well. And principle number 3 of the ERG movement is if your ERG program has a weak foundation, it will fail every single time. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies, this is where they're at right now, where they're realizing that this is not working for them. So I say all that to say, this is how a small company can set up its foundation properly. Okay. I think we kind of got the tone setters here. A lot of people, I get on calls, and in case you all didn't know, if you ever just want to talk about ERGs and you just need a thought partner, I'm around. I love talking about ERGs. I nerd out about them. But anyway, over the past year, I spoke to over 300 ERG leaders and program managers, and a few of them were from these small companies. And I would get this question all the time. Well, we're looking to launch ERGs. What's the best way that we should do it at our company? The first question in general, when people say that, is I ask them how many employees they have, because the answer will vary depending on that. So if they have under the 400 that we mentioned, the recommendation that I always give is to launch with a single ERG versus multiple. And when I say a single ERG, I'm not saying pick a community and let that be the ERG. I'm saying almost like a diversity council in a sense, but I don't want to approach it from the traditional lens of a diversity council. I'm saying treat this group of employees who are saying, I care about diversity and inclusion at the company like an ERG. We'll get into what that means specifically. This is so important though, because at a small company where there's already not that many employees, a strong ERG can really help to make D&I one of the center and core values of the company if it's done right. So, okay, why am I recommending this? There's 3 reasons in particular why a singular ERG made up of all the communities versus launching with multiple ERGs at once. The first reason is what I call the chapter effect. If you've spoken to me about chapters before, you know I have pretty strong opinions on them. So many companies launch their ERG programs with multiple chapters, like maybe it's region-based or based on office location, where now you have an ERG, but technically you have an ERG in 10 different places, and now there's so many people that are trying to do the same work, but people are spread super thin. That's what I call the chapter effect. I'm not a fan of chapters, or I should say this. In general, I believe that you should scale what works. So by implementing chapters too early, it is really setting up a program for success. Reverse. It's setting up a program for failure. How you set a small company up for success is the same principle. You wouldn't want to launch with multiple employee resource groups because you'll get that same effect. You don't have that many employees, so now you're spreading thin the amount of people who will be able to assist with this employee resource group. The infrastructure is not fully built out yet for the program. So now you're saying, okay, we're going to have these multiple ERGs, one for the Black community, one for the women community, one for our LGBTQ community. But now you're trying to scale a system that is not currently in place. What do I have here? Oh, you don't have any proven success on for any of the structures that currently exist. So it's going to be that much harder to manage each of the ERG leaders from those individual groups. It's going to be harder to align them on a centralized strategy. It's going to be harder to support them. Quality control is another thing that I bring up often, because now there might be more happening, maybe, because oftentimes that also brings in inconsistencies with the group, where some groups may do something monthly, some groups might do something once a year, and it's just so much harder to maintain that regularity in the program. That's why I'm a really big believer of making sure that you have one working system already and then scaling it. Now, you might say, well, wouldn't that apply to a big company too? Well, the difference, how I illustrate it, it's almost like with Legos. Just imagine like you're playing with like a big box of Legos, those little rectangle ones in particular. Let's just say this. You have 300 Legos. You have two options here. You can break up the Legos into separate stacks in the air. So maybe one stack has 30 that goes straight up, one has 20 that goes straight up. You're going to be more worried about that stack of Legos falling. Versus if you were to push all of those together, it makes such a stronger structure. I wish I could show you all like the image that I have illustrated here, but hopefully you kind of imagine what I'm saying. A standing up block of blocks by itself is so much weaker than one that's grouped together. I'm working on the imagery piece. But the same thing applies when it comes to this. When there's a large company, you have more blocks. So it's easier to stand them up by themselves and to split them up, versus with a small company, you're working with a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of people. So it's not wise to spread them apart in that sense, because then it's weaker. It's more likely to fail. Like I said, it's not that it can't happen eventually, but just to do it from the jump, there's so much more maintenance work that will need to be done, and there's steps that have been skipped in that sense. Another thing that I like to say when it comes to the chapter effect is it's going to be a lot harder to adapt. So as things change in the workplace, or as your processes update, it's going to be harder to get leadership on board to make these changes and to pivot, because you're not going to have to do it across multiple groups, where you could just have it within one group. Leadership that come from diverse backgrounds that all bring their piece to the table. That's going to be so much easier to get that group of people on board versus doing this separately amongst different ERGs. Okay, that's reason number one. Reason number two, I say the leadership structure, which we kind of touched on a little bit. When you think of an ERG, you might have a number in your brain, how many ERG leaders you are hoping to lead each ERG. If you were going to split it up, maybe you say like 2 to 3. I've voiced in previous videos, specifically on YouTube, like I said, plugging our YouTube channel, why I'm not a big fan of the 2-person ERG leadership structure. I can just do a quick recap though. The roles that I truly believe in an ERG leadership structure would be having co-chairs, but also having a membership engagement leader, an events lead, and a communications lead. Communications, events, co-chairs, and then member engagement, which includes finance basically. The thing is, and once again, we're going back to ERG should operate like a business enterprise. So think of a business in that sense. In a business, a CEO exists. There's marketing, there's finance, there's the operations people. But even if a business has only one person or two people in it currently, all of those roles still exist. Somebody still has to be over finance. Some person is still over marketing. But now that just becomes an addition. They have multiple things that make up their role. So if it's a one-person business, they're doing the marketing, they're doing the finance, they're doing CEO and operations work. The same concept works when it comes to an ERG leadership structure. Every ERG is going to need someone who takes ownership of the events, who takes ownership of the communications, who takes ownership of member engagement and what that really means for their ERG. But with a two-person ERG leadership structure, you're putting that burden where now one person has to be two of those things or three of those things. Not to mention there's also the added stress of like, these are volunteers 9 times out of 10. So that's now multiple roles on top of their actual role. On you all's end, for the people who are likely gonna launch this ERG, in addition, what you have to consider is if you're going to do multiple ERGs with multiple ERG leaders, what comes with that is, well, it's your responsibility to come up with this ERG leadership structure and the processes in place on how each person is to execute on that role. I talk about SOPs a lot, standardized operating procedures. Those things will have to exist, and you're the person responsible for establishing those before people get into the ERG leadership. It's going to be that much harder to do it with a two-person ERG leadership structure, or even to sell the idea of becoming an ERG leader, because now it's going to be so overwhelming and unclear what that person's role is. And unfortunately, this exists a lot in the ERG space today, even beyond small companies. A lot of companies don't have these clear leadership processes, which results in burnout. There's so many things that come with spreading people thin, and that's really not what we want. In addition to that, the third reason too would be membership. Obviously, the company's smaller, so the numbers are going to be lower. The ERG leadership oftentimes can feel discouraged when there's not that many people engaging in their ERG events and programming, and it's going to be that much harder to kind of keep that momentum up when 4 or 5 people are showing up. A good percentage that I've seen just working across multiple companies is from an ERG, you can expect on a monthly basis about 1 in 4. Optimistically, you can say 1 in 3 people participating in the ERG. So if you have an ERG that's made up of 50 people, that would be it would be less than 15 people on a monthly basis at a meeting. And in some cases, it's going to be the same 15 people over and over. That can be super unengaging. And even across the entire year, typically that gets to about like 75%. So there's some people, a good like 15 people of your ERG that you might never see at an event. This is really discouraging for the ERG's leaders. However, if you were to use a bigger pool of people now, where in a smaller company you can expect probably about 50% of the company to join this singular ERG. So now you have more people engaging. You don't feel as discouraged when people don't show up as well. So there's a few things. There's a few approaches to this, but overall, I'm a big fan of going with the singular ERG versus the multiple ERGs. I think those were the top 3 reasons. So I think we got that point through. What are the questions that people typically ask me when I make this recommendation for a singular ERG? The first question that I'm asked is, how do you maintain that sense of community among the people who have those shared characteristics? So for instance, for LGBTQ employees, how do you create a sense of community among them? A few answers to that. 1, you can have a small informal group still. Those smaller communities are okay, especially when you think about it. It's probably not going to be a huge group of people. Unfortunately, you see it oftentimes with small companies that the number of underrepresented people it's that much smaller. It's almost like a group chat, more or less, in that sense. And really encouraging those authentic connection moments, that'll also help to do that. You can even facilitate connections for these specific communities, especially when you think about Heritage Months, Black History Month coming up. How are you able to facilitate maybe some sort of networking among Black employees, lighting community members, especially like I said, during these Heritage Months. So making sure that people feel recognized and are seen by others. In a small company, it's already kind of hard to feel disconnected just because you're interacting with a good chunk of the company like on a regular basis. So most of the time people already know each other, but really giving that chance for people to tell a little bit about their background. Those are ways to build those authentic moments, which is going to help to build that sense of community. I made a post earlier this morning about building community is not even the majority of it. It's not saying we want to increase members, but it's really saying we want to increase the sense of community, the connectedness of people. So you're able to do that, like I said, facilitating moments, spotlighting of members, and also, once again, creating structure that makes it easy for other people to take responsibility on this. So what do I mean by that? So now, for instance, let's say that one of the members actually just wants to do like a Black employee meetup for Black History Month. And they want to know, well, will you all support us with budget? How would this work? Who do I need to go through? If you establish all that in advance, you'll empower people to take initiative on their own. So just a few ideas there. Another question that I get a lot would be, well, we don't really have that many people of color or underrepresented groups, and this would be made up mostly of allies. Or same concept would be, we don't have the data or access to the data that tells us how many people from these underrepresented backgrounds that we have. So how do we justify it? Or how do we approach this ERG knowing that it's going to be mostly allies? Something that I said, two things, because like I mentioned before, ERGs have to have a dual purpose. They have to impact its members and they also have to impact the business. But I would say make time to acknowledge and celebrate people, especially those heritage moments. That'll really help for the few people that do come from these underrepresented backgrounds to feel spotlit. But most importantly, make sure that you ask the members, how would you like to be engaged in this ERG? That is a huge question that most people aren't asking members. And then they're confused because they're saying we have low engagement, but in reality, they're not meeting the needs or the wants of their members. Their members may have joined the ERG wanting a certain thing or expecting a certain thing. But if you never ask the question, how can we deliver on your interests for being part of this group? It's going to be near impossible actually to be able to meet their interests. So that is really important. And we're going to dive into that when I go into this next part, final part here, which is how to launch this singular ERG at a company. I'll just give a hint. It's the same exact thing that we talked about last week with this relaunch plan. The only thing different is one, obviously, it's not a relaunch because it's an initial launch. In addition, because you're not doing multiple ERGs, you articulating the value of being part of this singular ERG would obviously look different as well. So we're going to talk about the 9 steps, once again, recapping what we talked about last week, to launching this community. So 9 steps, and then we'll go into Q&A. And we'll kind of go through it a little bit quickly because, like I said, we already talked about it last week. And it's on the site. There's an article. But anyway, so step 1 is assessment. You want to do a listening tour. This is what I was really just talking about when I said you want to poll people and ask, if we were to launch this community, what would you want out of it? That's qualitative feedback. And you're able then, especially if you ask consistent questions, you're able to then turn those responses into quantitative feedback. You're able to make charts and graphs that say, this is the type of programming that people would want coming out of this. From the people who responded, who were from this specific region, they really lean towards networking and connections. But people who were potentially, like, let's just say in our EMEA region, they really wanted more allyship resources. So all of this, when you put it all together, especially when you add in the listening tour results from executives and understanding what they would want out of the program, because in the future, a little bit further down the line, that's when you're really going to start implementing the business impact of the ERG. So putting all that together is going to help you to create your vision for the ERG program. Where would you like it to be? in 3 years? What's the ideal state of the ERG program? This is really, really important. You cannot make a strategy to go somewhere if you don't have a goal. It's like you can't have a map to go somewhere if there's no end destination. And most ERG programs right now don't have an end destination. So you have to understand what is the ideal state of the ERG program that combines what the executives want and what the members of the actual program will want from it. After you have the vision, you will then create the strategy. The strategy is the plan on how you're going to be able to achieve this. Expect that it's likely going to take I'm not going to say about 3 years, but at least 3 years to truly reach that full potential of the ERG program. Because really, after you launch, and if you've checked out the ERG movement model, within that adolescence phase, especially the mid to late adolescence phase, there are so many learnings that come about in terms of how are we going to tweak these processes that I originally made with no idea of like what works exactly for our company. So over time, as the ERG leaders come into place, they'll be able to say, oh, here's a recommendation I have, or to test out new ideas. So before your ERG reaches full maturity, there's going to be some learnings, and that takes a little bit of time. So you're going to create a strategy. It's going to have a timeline in terms of when you plan to reach your goal. It's also going to have milestones along the way that show that you're making progress towards it, ideally with metrics. Once again, even your vision that you originally create, that's step 2, should have metrics in it. Be really specific on what the goal is. This way it's easy for people to be able to identify progress towards that goal. It's also going to be mainly focused on community in that first half of the strategy. Like, how are we building the community in this space? And then later in the strategy, really double down on how are we now leveraging this community to drive business specific impact. You don't want to introduce business impact too early because it can kill a community. So after you have the strategy, you do step 4, which is get feedback from people, the same people that you did the listening tour on. Send them the doc, or you can even have another set of one-on-ones with them where you review the strategy and get their feedback. Personally, I've seen a lot of success of sending them the doc, allowing them to leave comments, and then just opening up my calendar to discuss more if need be. So far, recap of step 1 through 4: assessment, vision, strategy, and feedback. Step 5 now is structure. This is what I talked about before with the leadership structure. How many ERG leaders will you have on this singular ERG? I would recommend somewhere between 5 and 7. Those roles that I mentioned earlier with the co-chair, the events, the communications, and the member engagement core roles. We'll talk more about that next week. But that is the structure, and then you can just get multiple people for each of those roles. So maybe 2 co-chairs, 2 events, 2 communications, and 1 member engagement person. But regardless, for each of those ERG leadership roles, you'll need to create SOPs, standardized operating procedures, that make it really clear what this person would do in this role, what success looks like by being in this role. Also, even just articulating the value of the role. So saying, by you joining in this role, this is how you'll be impacted, or this is how it'll benefit you by being part of this role. Succession planning takes place after you've built a really strong structure for your ERG program, which, once again, the structure is really just answering the questions that people might have about your ERG and about your ERG's roles in advance, so they feel comfortable and more comfortable participating. So the succession that comes with step 6, that's getting people into the roles now. That's heavy on the marketing. How are you properly marketing this ERG and telling people about it? Once again, you can really advertise the benefits of being part of it. But ultimately, it's really just about filling up that leadership structure. You don't want any gaps in it. And for each role, like for instance, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but for instance, with communications chair, if someone who's interested in marketing or someone who's interested in getting into internal communications, this is a great opportunity for them. So really saying, hey, if this is you, or if you're looking to public speaking more, maybe the co-chair role is for you. Or if you're looking to get some face time with some of our executives, which at a small company might not be as big of a perk, but if it is at your specific company, you just have to know how to properly talk up these roles. This way you get people in them, because I do hear a lot of people saying it's so hard to get people to want to join. But if you lead with, oh, we need you all, and here's all the SOPs, you want to have those ready for when they join, but you don't want to overwhelm people to keep them from joining initially. After you get people in place, step 7 is onboarding. This is where you allow them to read through the SOPs and really understand what their role is. You open up your calendar for questions, for feedback, but it's really just about helping people to feel comfortable in the role before you officially roll out the program, because then that's when things start getting moving. Now that people are comfortable in their roles, step 8 is branding. So that is the design aspect of your ERG program, in this sense, your singular ERG. This is important. I think a lot of people can skip this step, but perceived value is important here. So when you have a really clear brand, even down to the colors, to the logo of the ERG, this is really important. This shows to the members that the ERG is really taking this seriously. Like, this is a serious program that they can now invest their time in. A lot of the time we feel as ERG leaders and program managers that we're almost like entitled to people feeling like they should get involved just because this is such important work. And yes, it is important work, but we still have to, one, articulate the value, but also show that we're investing in the actual program. And this comes down even to the things that can seem performative, but truly it's so you help to get the member buy-in, which is down to the branding. So that would also potentially include a website for your company's intranet, just making it really easy for people to be able to join when you do launch. So investing some time into that, you can take your ERG leaders through a workshop where they all understand the ERG's mission a little bit more, or even help to craft it. So these are some of the things that go into branding. The final step of the launch plan for the singular ERG for small companies is to create a pre-launch plan for your actual debut of your ERG. Now that it's out, you've done all this work, you don't want it to fall flat and say like, okay, we're launching this today and no one hears about it, no one knows about it. So this is where that marketing comes back into place. How are you talking about this in advance, getting people excited for it? I typically recommend that people do like a big event for their launch. This way it gets people excited, and it's almost like a membership growth event. I hope that makes sense. Membership growth, yes. But after you do launch, it's important that you remain consistent with your programming. I'm not saying that things have to be just as big as that first event, but it is important that now that you have an ERG in place, you've told members about it, you've asked them what they want from it, you need to deliver on those wants, and you need to deliver it consistently, yes. And that's, once again, why it's so important that you don't do this with multiple ERGs at once. With a small company, this is so much harder to do. I've seen it fail time and time again. I'm begging you all not to do it that way. But just putting my piece out there. Once again, this is the opportunity to really embed D&I at the core of the business. Because if this program goes well, and if you follow these 9 steps, it will go well. You have an opportunity to really get easily 50-75% of the people on board to making change and making your work environment more diverse, more inclusive, more accessible, all the things that we really care about in this space. But if it's not done right, this will become almost like an irritant to people. They won't pay attention to the programming. Even when you go and you do this really important work, you'll have no backing and no support from the members, the people who are really going to help to drive these changes. Okay. That's my final piece for today. So, like I said, next week's topic will be the ERG leadership structure that you need and the ones you don't. Specifically, we're going to be talking about, and you already got a preview here, in terms of the 2-person ERG leadership structure where it's like co-presidents or co-chairs and why that by itself doesn't work. Also the pillar-based ERG leadership structure. So if it's like you go by the 4 C's and that's how you structure your ERG, why that is not sustainable long-term. So we'll be talking about that. We'll go through the individual roles. We talked a little bit today about like what would make each of those roles successful. So we'll dive really into that next week, which I'm excited for. As I mentioned earlier, if any of you all ever have questions and like I said, you just don't feel comfortable speaking in this forum, always feel free to message me. I do reply. If I don't reply, just message me again and I promise I will reply. And yeah, I look forward to speaking to you all next week. Have a great one and make sure that you check out the ERG Idea Hub.